Hi guys, and welcome back to Kabir Considers. In this video, we're going to react to what was it like being a Civil War soldier. What was life like, This is a fierce war. Conditions are probably not great, like sleeping conditions. Obviously, safety-wise, you never know where, enemy forces are going to turn up. Just a completely different way of life. We're talking hundreds of years ago, where things like memory foam mattresses and and heated seats and stuff like that just didn't exist. Where life must have been brutal, but this is I guess that's just the life they had to live. So it's going to be really fun to get a little glimpse of this historic war and what life was like. It's going to be awesome.
We'll put it bluntly. The life of a Civil War soldier sucked. Sure, all war is hell, but if you signed up to be a Civil War soldier, it was essentially the equivalent to signing your own death certificate. Today, we're exploring what life was really like to be a Civil War soldier. But before we get started, this is a good time to subscribe to our channel, Weird History. Leave us a comment or tell us what weird phenomenon, person, or event you'd like us to cover next. Now, let's go to the 1860s. Of the 2.7 million soldiers who fought in the Civil War, in over 237 named battles along with a bunch of smaller, albeit bloody face-offs and confrontations, they all weren't brawny, bearded adult men with wives and slaves back home. Approximately 420,000 were Northern boys under the age of 17, and the South had an estimated 100,000 soldiers under the age of 15. These boys weren't landowners, and they definitely didn't own slaves. As a matter of fact, it's reported that the teens on both sides of the war had neutral feelings toward slavery. The reason why these kids joined the war was simply that they wanted to escape their dull farm lives at home. Thanks to Abraham Lincoln's call for a short 90-day tour of duty, a Union soldier could enlist, put in his combat time for a few months, and then return home for accolades and a hero's welcome. What the Northern soldiers couldn't have predicted was that the Civil War was going to drag out for years. After the Union was driven out of Richmond in the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, the Confederate Army began to march on to Washington. The South was starting to look like they had a chance to win this thing, thanks to their Peninsula win. That's when Lincoln issued a call for 300,000 more Union soldiers with 3-year commitments. Only a fraction of those 300,000 Union soldiers would last their 3 years of brutal combat.
Damn. Gosh, imagine that. You're 15 or even 14. You're off to war. Like the average 14-year-old kid these days, they're spending their time on, social media, TikTok, whatever, playing video games, just living a somewhat normal teenage life, not really a care in the world. And 1860, you're going to fight for your life. It's different, completely different.
How desperate were the underage boys to join the Civil War and begin living life? Well, there'd been a lot of rules to get in. For example, they relied on semantics. Because the rules of combat stated that a soldier must be over 18 to join the military, an underage kid would write the number 18 on the sole of a shoe or stuff a piece of paper with the number 18 scrawled on it and hide it in his boot. Then when the recruiter would ask if the boy was over 18, the future war hero would technically be telling the truth by answering, "Yes, I am over 18. If that didn't work, the kids would just lie about their age because social security numbers, driver's licenses, and Spokio didn't exist. If all else failed, the teens just asked their fathers to vouch for them. That said, not all teens carried arms. A lot of the kids signed up for non-combat roles like joining the band as a drummer, flautist, or bugler. These non-combat roles also included being the kid to carry canteens, bandages, and stretchers. Some of the more skilled soldiers even
if they're just carrying canteens, they're still contributing to the war effort, I guess.
assisted surgeons and nurses with the wounded and acted as a carrier pigeon by relaying orders on the battlefield. William Sherman coined the phrase, "war is hell," in 1879, 15 years after the Civil War, where he served as a general for the Union Army. Sherman knew a great deal about death on the battlefields because he saw a lot of it. For example, on July 1st, 1863, the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Confederate soldiers marched onto the battlefield in straight lines toward their enemy. Union soldiers decimated the Confederate soldiers. According to the South's General Alfred Iverson, his soldiers died an honorable death. They nobly fought and perished without a man running to the rear. No greater gallantry and heroism has been displayed. The Confederate soldiers...
Imagine that, just watching, tons of your comrades just getting mowed down next to you. You know, 1 second you're having a conversation, they're dead. Just, it's got to do so much damage to you mentally. Like, obviously for the ones that died, you know, they're dead. And their families have got to, like, you know, live with that. But just to witness all of that death,
weren't as romantic about death on the battlefield as Iverson was. In fact, it sounded like they were fighting two different wars. Iverson's soldiers would recall huddling in the mud as bullets whizzed above them. One of Iverson's men described the moment when 79 of his fellow soldiers were slain in one volley. Great God, when will this stop?
80 men. Like, oh my God, that's crazy.
According to the book Hardy's Rifle and Light Infantry Tactics, soldiers from the North and South were supposed to be taken care of while issued the following: pork, bread, beef, vegetables, potatoes, peas, hominy, roasted coffee beans, sugar. Unfortunately, both sides of the war struggled to supply their soldiers with these basic necessities. The Confederates much more than the Union. Johnny Reb rarely saw any of the aforementioned rations. Instead, the Confederate soldiers subsisted on cornbread, coffee, cigarettes, and anything they could steal. Any food the soldiers did get their hands on often became infested with insects, especially rice or grain, within days. All of this meant that the soldiers had to rely on their cunning to survive. Soldiers would supplement their meager rations by foraging on the land, receiving boxes of food from their families, or trading items with other soldiers, even if they traded with the enemy. Yep, it wasn't uncommon for Union soldiers to trade their coffee with the Confederate soldiers in exchange for tobacco away from the eyes of their officers.
Wow. Honestly, and I mean, like, because if you're fighting a war, keeping your soldiers well fed, for me, if I was like a general or in the chain of hierarchy, keep those soldiers fed well, because their morale, do anything you can to keep their morale high. Mate, a hungry soldier, they're not going to be fighting to their full capacity. Yeah, but obviously they didn't have any options. They didn't have fridges back then or freezers. So how are you going to keep the food fresh and, you know, from spoiling?
Civil War soldiers didn't have much of a chance to live if they were seriously wounded in battle. Picture it. You're keeping the enemy at bay by shooting one round every 20 to 30 seconds. But as you pack your musket with gunpowder, you get hit in the stomach by enemy fire. In the 1860s, injured Civil War soldiers on both sides had to just sort of lie on the grassy knoll and play dead where they were shot in the hopes of an ambulance wagon coming by and tending to their wounds.
Wow.
If they were lucky, they had a flask full of sipping whiskey to numb the pain from the hole in their belly. If these soldiers were extra lucky, a horse-drawn ambulance wagon would come by with medical supplies and patch them up. If an ambulance wagon wasn't able to reach a wounded soldier out on the battleground, they would most likely perish.
Jesus.
We're not going to sugarcoat it. Getting shot by the enemy with the Springfield Model 1861 musket was bad. But you know what was worse? Disease. The thing is, you might have lived if you were shot, but if you got sick, caught a disease, or developed an infection during what's been called the bloodiest war in American history, you were as good as dead. To put it in perspective, the Union suffered the loss of 44,000 lives from dysentery and diarrhea. To put it in perspective, the Union suffered the loss of 44,000 lives from dysentery. That's the equivalent of 10 Gettysburg battles. More men died from disease than anything else during the Civil War. Union Private Theodore Garish wrote,
"The conditions must have been awful, like just the infections just rampant, because there's no antibiotics, there's no medication really that we would call medication today, at least. Like, what did they probably have? Just isopropyl, like alcohol, I guess, just to clean wounds. Did they have aspirin back then? Painkillers? Probably not."
This of the Civil War
Maybe.
conditions he faced. One of the most disastrous features of the gloomy situation was the terrible sickness of the soldiers. Men were unused to the climate, the exposure, and the food, so that the whole experience was in direct contrast to their life at home. Infection was a major problem because doctors didn't sterilize equipment. During the course of the conflict in its entirety, hospital workers performed amputations on 60,000 men, with at least 1 in 4 dying from infection.
Oh my God.
We all remember why the Civil War happened, right? What we don't understand is how they thought black Americans were going to help and pitch in to destroy the Union. Because the Confederates were rightly concerned about arming their slaves, Southern black men were enlisted mostly for camp labor. The closest the Confederacy came to recruiting slaves to the ranks came in the last few desperate weeks of the war. In fact, when the Union began enlisting black soldiers, Confederate President Jefferson Davis declared that captured black soldiers would either be enslaved or executed. When a Confederate general suggested enlisting slaves, Confederate leaders scoffed. On March 13, 1865, the Confederate Congress allowed black soldiers to enlist, without promising their freedom after the conflict ended. Their desperate move made no difference. The war would be over less than a month later.
Wow, you couldn't even offer them freedom? You know, crazy. Like nothing.
As a Civil War soldier, if you weren't firing your musket at the face of your enemy on the battlefield or sleeping, you were running drills with your troop. Soldiers spent a majority of their waking hours preparing for active conflict by cleaning their firearm and learning drills and combat formations, with the occasional stint at guard duty or a long march. Private Theodore Garish of the Union explained how unprepared soldiers were at the very start of the war. We had never been drilled. An untrained drum corps furnished us with music. Each musician kept different time, and each man in the regiment took a different step. We marched, ran, walked, galloped, and stood still in our vain endeavors to keep step. If you were a black soldier and you proved yourself reputable, discrimination in pay was still par for the course in the early 1860s, even if you were defending the Union. Unfortunately, the Union didn't enlist black soldiers until 1862, but recruitment grew further after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued on January 1, 1863. And while they were getting paid, according to the Militia Act of 1862, black privates were still getting paid a lot less for equal work. Black soldiers received $10 a month with a $3 optional clothing deduction, while in comparison, white privates started at $13 a month and received a clothing allowance of $3.50.
Wow, $10 a month. Obviously, things were way cheaper. But you know, how much? What would that be in modern money? Can't be that much. Probably what, like 100, maybe a couple hundred in modern money.
If you were one of the hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the front lines, stuffing your musket with bullets and gunpowder and firing every 20 seconds, if you were fast, there's a good chance your arms were useless by the end of the day. The rifled muskets that soldiers on both sides used weighed up to 10 pounds, and they would recoil with such force, just firing the thing could put your arm out of commission. Confederate Private Sam R. Watkins described the experience. After undressing, I found my limb all battered and bruised and bloodshot from my wrist to my shoulder, and as sore as a blister. I had shot 120 times that day. These muskets also regularly overheated, making them hard to reload. Watkins continued, "My arm became so hot that frequently the powder would flash before I could ram home the ball, and I had frequently to exchange my arm for that of a fallen comrade."
Oh my God, wow.
We forgot to mention one thing that soldiers did when they weren't fighting, sleeping, or cleaning the rifle. They read and wrote like it was going out of style. It was really important for soldiers to read everything they could get their hands on and write to their loved ones as often as possible. The soldiers struggled to describe the horrors of the conflict in their letters home. Many thought they could not relate their experiences to civilian audiences, but some tried. Charles Carroll Morey, a captain for the Union, described one skirmish in stark terms. "Soon after we arrived on the ground, we were firing. And just after I had discharged my piece at a Johnny's head, I turned to reload. I saw a Reb who had got sight of me across his musket, and I can assure you my legs grew very short in a very short space of time, or else there was a joint in them. That is to say, I dropped down out of his sight just in time to hear his bullet whistle over my head. Then, knowing the danger had passed, I straightened up and finished loading." Morey felt lucky to be alive, writing, "I don't know what to say first, but we'll say praise God for his goodness in sparing my life while so many of our brave comrades have fallen victims to the enemy's shots." So what do you think? Would you want to be a soldier in the Civil War? Let us know.
Amazing video. Such, so well done. Really captured the awful conditions that these soldiers had to deal with, you know. If you got shot, you were pretty much dead, pretty much. If you got an infection, you were pretty much dead, you know? Or you could potentially lose a limb. Food was scarce, and whatever food you probably could get your hands on probably didn't taste very good. You never knew when you were gonna see your family again. And very often they didn't. They just didn't make it out. Just absolutely horrific, man. I wonder what the average length of duty was. For the soldiers that made it you know, to the end. Or if you were to add up all of the soldiers, the ones that died in combat versus the ones that made it to the end and made it back home, if you averaged everything out, are we talking probably weeks, I guess. If you account for all of the ones that died, it's probably like weeks or maybe months. Just a absolutely horrific event, you know. Like the narrator said, you know, war is hell. War is hell. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.